Martha, is it hot in Florida?
It's pretty hot, yeah. I tell you what, it's more humid than I'm used to.
It's 34 degrees in DC.
Oh, it's not as hot as that.
And of the 4 people we sent to the White House today, 3 of us are bald. So we all look a bit tonight like Martha Kellner, redheads.
Well, everyone wants to be a redhead these days. I'm trying to tot up the bald people in the office. So it's you, it's Gabriel, the podcast producer. Who's the other bald person? Oh, Ed Young, of course, cameraman.
A disproportionate number of follically challenged members of staff. I'm David Blevins in Washington, D.C., after a day in the baking heat of the White House.
And I'm Martha Kellner, as I say, not in Los Angeles today. I'm in Tampa in Florida. I'll explain why a little later. Back in the capital, though, David, potentially very important news for the Middle East, delivered by Donald Trump on Truth Social. Where else?
Yes, the president posted that as of Thursday night, there would be a ceasefire between Israel and Lebanon. It sounds like big news, Martha, but will this ceasefire actually mean anything if Hezbollah aren't even at the table? And how will it be perceived by allies who've kept their distance from the war in Iran? I asked Donald Trump that directly.
Plus, did Pete Hegseth, the Defence Secretary accused of starting a holy war in Iran, just mistake Pulp Fiction for the Bible? This is one of my all-time favourite stories from this administration. It feels like 4 seasons total landscaping for a new generation. We'll chat about that and also about the President and the Pope with their continuing war of words. And RFK Jr, the Health Secretary, back to doing weird things with animals. So, David, you've been, as we say, down at the White House today because of that announcement from Donald Trump on Truth Social. It came at midday US time on Wednesday. He says Israel and Lebanon have agreed to a 10-day ceasefire.
Yes, this was another of the president's big foreign policy announcements delivered via social media. He wrote, "I just had excellent conversations with the highly respected President Joseph Aoun of Lebanon and Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu of Israel. These 2 leaders have agreed that in order to achieve peace between their countries, they will formally begin a 10-day ceasefire at 5 p.m. Eastern." A little later, he went on to say, "It has been my honour to solve 9 wars across the world, and this will be my 10th, so let's get it done." The words "get it done" in capital letters.
Of course. Interesting that we're on to 9 wars solved. I'm not quite sure how we got up to 9. Probably also worth totting up the number of wars that Donald Trump has started as well. Israel, Lebanon, never been particularly friendly neighbours, but the latest round outbreak of violence between the 2 countries is only resulting from Donald Trump's decision to start bombing Iran at the end of February.
Yeah, well, exactly. We should always think of the context for this. President Trump is claiming to have brokered a ceasefire between Israel and Lebanon, but that's a war that was really only reignited by his war with Iran.
Yeah.
Added to that, it's a very vague ceasefire announced on Truth Social. We don't even know how it's going to play out on the ground. Not that Donald Trump has ever allowed the reality on the ground to get in the way of the optics. For me, Martha, it's reminiscent of the peacemaking between warring factions back in my native Northern Ireland. Mm-hmm. The Good Friday Agreement is often described as creative ambiguity. Yeah. Well, this ceasefire in Lebanon is equally ambiguous, shall we say?
It is. The president wrote 2 posts on Truth Social, both in quick succession and both about the ceasefire. In the second post, Trump announced that the Israeli Prime Minister and the Lebanese president had been invited to the White House for the first face-to-face meeting since 1983. So obviously the president dressing this up as a success. But as you say, there are a few realities that are missing, few hurdles to overcome. First and foremost, what's going to happen with Hezbollah being the Iran-backed militant group that operates at the moment in southern Lebanon.
Yes, it's a really crucial question. Israel and Hezbollah are the 2 main players in this conflict in southern Lebanon. The Lebanese government even banned Hezbollah a month or so ago. So how are they going to keep a radical non-governmental group in check? The president seems to think that the Lebanese government will be able to control Hezbollah and make sure that they adhere to this ceasefire. but there's no real history of Lebanon having been able to do that in the past.
Yeah, it's rather convenient timing, isn't this, for Donald Trump? He is claiming this as a big deal and a foreign policy win, and he is desperate for a foreign policy victory at the moment. He's framing himself as the peacemaker. We know he campaigned on playing that role on the world stage. So this suggestion that this is the 10th war, or it will be the 10th war that he's ended, there's domestic capital in that, because he can go to the American people and claim that this policy of peace through strength that he keeps parroting, that is working.
Yes, he talks a lot about peace through strength, but of course his UK and European allies might argue that he's bringing about peace by waging war or by threatening war in various places. So before the president left the White House for an event in Las Vegas, I asked him how he thought this ceasefire in Lebanon might be perceived across the Atlantic.
Mr. President, what message do you think the ceasefire in Lebanon? What message do you think the ceasefire in Lebanon sends to the UK and other European allies who chose not to get involved in the war?
Well, we spend trillions and trillions of dollars on NATO, and when I asked them to get involved on a much smaller situation, which is Hormuz and Iran, they weren't there for us. Remember what I said? They weren't there. None of them. They weren't there. So we were there on Ukraine. I mean, we shouldn't have been. It would have never happened if I were president. But nevertheless, when they've had problems over the years, we were there. When we asked them to get involved on a very minor skirmish by comparison to what it could be, they weren't there. So I don't think they'd be there for a large skirmish, and therefore I think they've got themselves a problem.
He can't stop talking to Sky News, can he, this week? I thought it was clever, David, and I am sure deliberate, that you got the Trump 100 microphone muff, the thing that goes on top of the microphone, right in the president's eye line as you spoke to him. And I was disappointed that he didn't seem to clock onto it, though.
Yes, I was hoping it would catch his eye, and I was poised if it did, Martha. My response immediately would have been, welcome to the Trump 100 podcast, Mr. President.
Again.
Indeed. He definitely was in a chatty mood today. He spent a long time on the South Lawn speaking to a number of different reporters, clearly very pleased with what he says is the beginning of the end to a 10th global war on his watch. And yes, Martha, there is a ceasefire now in place, but the big question is, will it hold? That's really anyone's guess in a region that is very volatile and never straightforward.
Yeah, and worth remembering too that life doesn't just go back to normal for the Lebanese people now. Thousands of them have died in rocket strikes since the wider US-Iran war began. It really has been incredibly bleak, devastating there. Beirut, the capital, has seen buildings across the city turned to rubble. The south of Lebanon overnight really became a war zone. So a return to normality, not as simple as, just announcing it on Truth Social.
Absolutely not.
So, David, while the president was fielding the throng of reporters, including your good self, outside the White House, he was also asked about this ongoing spat that he's got with the Pope, of all people.
I have to do what's right. The Pope has to understand that. Very simple. I have nothing against the Pope. His brother's MAGA all the way. I like his brother, Louis. I'm not fighting with him. The Pope made a statement. He says Iran can have a nuclear weapon. I say Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon. And if the Pope looked at the 42,000 people that were killed over the last 2 or 3 months as a protester with no weapons, no nothing, I mean, you take a look at that. So I can disagree with the Pope. I have a right to disagree. I have a right to disagree with the Pope.
What do you say to people who see that, who see your criticism of the...
Look, nothing, I have no disagreement with the fact the Pope can say what he wants, and I want him to say what he wants, but I can disagree.
Trump was also asked separately if he would agree to meet with Pope Leo to even out their differences. Evangelical Christians, a very key support base for the president. He said he didn't think that a meeting would be necessary.
This all came about after Pope Leo made unusually strong remarks that seemed to be aimed at the Trump administration. He's on a visit to Cameroon right now, touring African countries this week, and it was there he criticised those who use religious language to justify war.
The world is being ravaged by a handful of tyrants, yet is held together by a multitude of supportive brothers and sisters. They are the descendants of Abraham, as numerous as the stars in the sky and the grains of sand on the seashore. Let us look into each other's eyes. We are this immense people. Peace is not something we must invent. It is something we must embrace by accepting our neighbor as our brother and as our sister.
Now, the pontiff didn't mention the US president by name, but he did call for a change of course. And the most senior Anglican, the Archbishop of Canterbury, has also weighed in now, saying she stands with Pope Leo in what she said was a courageous call for a kingdom of peace.
Yeah, you mentioned, David, that the Pope is in Cameroon, and worth saying there is a deadly conflict ongoing between separatists in Cameroon at the moment. There has been a 3-day pause in violence to allow for the safe passage of the Pope. So we don't know whether he was talking about the situation in Cameroon or if he was talking about the conflict in the Middle East. But we do know that papal speeches for foreign trips are often written weeks in advance of the event. But, it does seem like quite the coincidence considering what's been going on with President Trump over the last few days.
Indeed, picking a fight with the head of the Roman Catholic Church, a man whom Roman Catholics regard as God's representative of Christ on earth, remains totally at odds with an administration that is known to invoke religious language on a regular basis.
Yeah, and this has angered the base in a way that, a lot of things that you would think would upset people about Donald Trump and his conduct online don't do. And of course, this picture that he posted in which he appeared to be depicted as Jesus. Donald Trump said that he thought that he was depicted as a doctor there. And there's been some speculation online, I'm not sure you've seen, David, but the press secretary, Caroline Leavitt, in her press conference, she was asked, why is Donald Trump posting himself, dressed up as Jesus? And she said, this was a doctored image. And that was just a short while before Donald Trump said that he thought he was a doctor. So some people are wondering if maybe he misheard or misunderstood what the guidance to give to the press on that was. Anyway, this holy war of words shows no sign of letting up.
Yeah, and the Pope's call for people to think twice before using religious language to justify wars fell on deaf ears at the Pentagon. During the latest briefing from there, Pete Hegseth, the man who calls himself Secretary of War, recalled a sermon he had heard in church on Sunday from the book of Mark, in which the Pharisees were attempting to trip up Jesus. He then went on to describe journalists covering the war in Iran as Pharisees. Now, does that mean he sees himself or sees President Trump as Jesus? He didn't go that far, of course, but it is a remarkable thing to say just a few days after President Trump deleted a post online in which he appeared to be depicted as Jesus.
It's funny, isn't it? Because this is something I was delving into a few weeks ago. I went on a reporting trip to Oklahoma to ask that very question. Is it right that Pete Hegseth is using biblical rhetoric to justify the war in the Middle East? Is there an increasing blurring of lines between church and state? And I went to the church, which is run by a guy called Jackson Lehmeyer. He heads up an organization called Pastors for Trump, and he is close, friendly with the Trump family. And I spoke to some members of his congregation, and they, were talking about Donald Trump as a conduit for God's will. They said the war is God's will and that Donald Trump is just following through on that. America is obliged to support Israel in their eyes because it is the Holy Land, the Promised Land. And, they were talking in terms of Armageddon. But I guess, we might question today how well exactly Pete Hegseth knows the Bible.
Yes, he may know more about cinematology than theology, it seems, especially Tarantino films. During what is now a weekly service at the Pentagon, that's a service of worship I'm talking about, he claimed the man leading the search for the 2 Air Force crew members who'd been shot down in Iran had given him a prayer and recited it. He said it was entitled CSAR 2517, that's Combat Search and Rescue 2517, and that it borrows some wording from the Bible verse Ezekiel 25:17.
So the prayer is CSAR 25:17, and it reads, and pray with me, please. The path of the downed aviator is beset on all sides by the iniquities of the selfish and the tyranny of evil men. Blessed is he who, in the name of camaraderie and duty, shepherd the lost through the valley of darkness, for he is truly his brother's keeper and the finder of lost children. And I will strike down upon thee with great vengeance and furious anger those who attempt to capture and destroy my brother. And you will know my call sign is Sandy 1, when I lay my vengeance upon thee. And amen. So thank you for joining us this month, every month. Thank you for worshiping with us and taking just that moment, which, as I say every time, is fitting and proper to do in this building, at this time, in this place, with Americans in harm's way on our behalf, halfway across the world. May we always pray for them, think about them, put them first in our actions and the decisions that we make. That is who we serve, and they put themselves out there to serve us. And I know this audience appreciates that more than almost any Americans in the entire world.
What he didn't mention was that it had been adapted almost word for word from a violent monologue delivered by the actor Samuel L. Jackson in Pulp Fiction before the character kills someone. So it has really caused quite a stir on social media.
This is hilarious, isn't it? I said earlier, it feels like Four Seasons total landscaping for a new generation. I just don't know how this came to be. You know, if you put beyond parody into your search bar, a picture of Pete Hegseth would come up, or at least that's what Pete Hegseth told me. I just love it so much.
Yeah, and quite remarkable that no one raised it this morning. But of course, there is a very different press corps these days for Pentagon briefings, and this was the first briefing we'd had in some time. He really had 2 big messages. The first for Iran, telling them to choose wisely, making it very clear that the ceasefire could end just as quickly as it began.
Yeah, so much bombast with that press conference, wasn't there? And you mentioned about it being a very different press corps in the Pentagon these days, and that's because Pete Hegseth has chucked out all of the reporters that he doesn't particularly like, the mainstream news and all of that. So it really is an interesting time to be covering the Department of Defense if you can get access to the Department of Defense or the Department of War.
So who are the Pharisees? The old press corps or the new press corps?
Who knows, David? You can see why Donald Trump likes Hegseth, or at least he seems to still be sticking by him at the moment. And that's because he counterpunches in a way that Donald Trump does. You know, he's the first to hit back and, you know, seems to engage in this handgun on the table style of negotiation.
And to Iran, choose wisely. I pray you choose a deal which is within your grasp for the betterment of your people and for the betterment of the world. In the meantime, the War Department is locked and loaded.
Yes, choose wisely in one breath. We're locked and loaded in another. And the second message he wanted to deliver was to anyone attempting to bring a tanker through the Strait of Hormuz. Hegseth says it's the United States alone that is maintaining a blockade there, that Iran doesn't have the capability to do so, that they've turned back 13 vessels so far, and he's urging any country, not just Iran, that would wish to bring a tanker through the Strait of Hormuz to comply with the orders of the United States or risk the consequences.
Speaking of colourful members of Donald Trump's administration, David, there's another weird story about the Health and Human Services Secretary, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. I'm going to allow you to tell it, David.
I'm so grateful, Martha. Kennedy spent most of his life as a Democrat, of course. He's famously the nephew of the 35th President, John F. Kennedy. He stood for president himself as an independent, you'll recall, but then dropped out and endorsed the Republican nominee. Guess who? Donald J. Trump in 2024. Well, there's a new book out called RFK Jr, The Rise and Fall. And in it, there's a diary entry from the 11th of November 2001 involving, now wait for it, a raccoon. And I quote, and I stress, I quote, I was standing in front of my parked car on I-684, cutting the penis out of a road-killed raccoon, thinking about how weird some of my family members have turned out to be. Words you never thought you'd utter into a Trump 100 microphone.
Oh my God. Yeah, he's told the author of this book, Isabel Vincent, that he took the raccoon's genitals so he could study them later. I'm not going to ask too many questions about how that works, but this isn't the first time that there's been an eyebrow-raising situation enjoying RFK Jr. and an animal. So there was outrage over claims that he once severed the head of a washed-up whale with a chainsaw and then strapped it to the car's roof. But the most well-known ones involving the bear, of course.
Yes, didn't he want... Sorry. Yes, didn't he once confess to dumping a dead bear cub in Central Park in New York?
Yeah, actually, I take back what I said earlier. That's my favourite story involving this administration. But yeah, there's a decade-long mystery about this dead bear in Central Park, solved by RFK Jr., now in charge of health in America. I mean, you quite literally could not make it up, could you?
From dead bear cubs to dead raccoons. I don't know where we're going next. Well, I'm ready to go and lie down in a darkened room and hope I waken up on the right side of the looking glass, Martha.
Yeah, I could do with a lie down too, David, but I'm currently editing a piece that we've been out filming today, which is about peptides, which is partly under RFK Jr.'s jurisdiction. He's been talking about loosening the rules around peptides, which are these injections that are becoming increasingly popular. You know, lots of people online claiming, you know, they make them stronger, fitter, better looking. So I'm looking into how RFK Jr. Is having a bearing on that world of peptides. So hopefully be more to talk about on that on next week's podcast.
We look forward to that. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back on Tuesday, barring any major news.
Yeah, and Trump100@sky.uk is the email as ever if you have any questions or comments.
Have a great weekend. Bye-bye.
See you soon.